And I really want to thank Tiffany and Anne for coming today. And I'm looking forward to everybody's popcorn. I'm going to check that out. Maybe I'll get something new. And we should buy popcorn also, because I heard that there is an oversupply of popcorn this year, and there are a bunch of farmers who really make their living on it. And because nobody's going out to movies, there's a certain kind of popcorn, like loose popcorn, that is oversupplied in the market, not microwave popcorn. Anyway, I just wanted to share it because it was really interesting, and it's interesting how this whole crisis ripples through different communities. Yeah, so I want to thank Tiffany and Anne for coming to talk about the Equitable Adaptation Toolkit from Georgetown Climate Center. It's really exciting. The more that I read it, the more I'm impressed by the language that's used in it, and also just the way that it's pulling together resources that I've seen in other places and resources I haven't seen in other places. Tiffany, we have links. I will put a link into the chat, but there's also a link in the notes to bios for Tiffany, Ganthier, and Perrault. But Tiffany is the Institute Associate at Georgetown Climate Center, and she focuses on equitable adaptation. And she will be speaking on the procedural equity, what it means, and some examples of how it can be used. And then Anne Perrault is a senior fellow at the Georgetown Climate Center working on climate finance issues. And she will speak more specifically to the finance toolkit. And I'm just going to turn it over to you. If there's anything that either of you feel like is useful context, background, or any questions you have for us, please feel free to bring those up. Tiffany?
Hi, everyone. Yep, like you just said, I'm Tiffany Ganthier. I guess just to tell you a little bit about GCC and Georgetown Climate Center, we have been serving as a resource to federal, state, and local governments working to reduce emissions that cause climate change and taking steps to make their communities more resilient as they adapt to impacts of climate change. So we have a mitigation team as well as an adaptation team. Anne and I are both on the adaptation team. So we are based at Georgetown Law Center in DC, and we've been around since 2009. So that's just a little bit about GCC. So the Equitable Adaptation Toolkit, it builds on GCC's earlier work on urban heat and green infrastructure and sea level rise to provide a resource for best and emerging practices in adaptation planning. So I don't know if you all are familiar with our adaptation clearinghouse, but we specifically added an equity portal, which houses all of the equity related resources in our clearinghouse and all the resources that have a strong equity angle. And that happened a few years ago. So those resources have include our work on the ground with communities like in DC and Ward 7 and in Louisiana. So any work that we've actually been able to be a part of on the ground can be found in our equity portal as well. So this toolkit is kind of like an elaboration on that equity portal. So we've been working on this for the past 2 years. And so yeah, that's who we are. So we've been working on this for the past 2 years. And basically, you know, with the changes we're seeing being driven by climate change all over the country, it's kind of just been important to acknowledge that climate impacts especially affect those already suffering from cumulative burdens of pollution, racism, political and economic marginalization, and all the other marginalization issues that are affecting certain communities. So this subject is more relevant now and more urgent than ever. So even as the effects of climate change are more obvious and more urgent, the consequences of this country's history is still relevant and at the forefront of our minds and still having a great impact on certain communities more so than other. So what we sought to accomplish in compiling this toolkit is to both define what it means to take an equity-centered approach to prepare frontline communities and for the realities of climate change, as well as provide examples through our case studies of how state and local planning professionals have implemented the legal and policy tools to achieve equitable outcomes. So we were just talking before this call that we're hoping to move beyond planning, although we do discuss planning tools, but the case studies are really ideas of how to actually put it into motion and actually, use the tools. So the toolkit is intended to aid local governments and community-based organizations nationwide that are focusing on centering equity in their climate adaptation initiatives. And the toolkit explores practices and case studies from a wide variety of cities and draws lessons from those different approaches. It also provides a framework to help people tailor legal and policy options for their own jurisdictions and to advance equitable responses to the impacts of climate change. So this is kind of how we're defining frontline communities, as you can see on the slide here. So what's in the actual Equitable Adaptation Toolkit? So for purposes of this toolkit, equity is defined as an approach based in fairness, designed to ensure that everyone has access to the same opportunities and resources. So in practice, building equity in the climate resilience planning and implementation involves not just addressing the disproportionate impacts that affect those frontline communities, but also working to dismantle barriers that have prevented frontline communities from thriving. So that's why this toolkit focuses on delivering diverse and inclusive engagement processes and procedural equity, as well as substantive outcomes. So that first big focus, like I said, is that procedural equity. So those are tools for planning, engagement, and governance, and how to actually engage the community and make sure that all voices are involved in decision-making and planning processes. And then the second big focus is substantive equitable outcomes. So in other words, actually like implementing policy solutions and programs that seek to more fairly distribute access to the benefits of these programs. And finally, the financing section of the toolkit. So there we provided detailed information about the practical legal and policy options decision makers and communities have for ensuring that those resources reach the communities that need them. Money is usually, the biggest problem in implementing these ideas. So we made sure to go into a separate section on funding and financing. So, so just to tell you a little bit about me, so I was the project manager of the toolkit and the lead author. So I wrote a few chapters, but there was a overall team, GCC team, and a few other authors who tackled these subjects for the past 2 years. So Anne, she's our senior fellow, and she led the funding and finance section of the toolkit and is the lead author of that section. So she's going to run you through that section later. So procedural equity. So the first 3 chapters of the toolkit explore tools that can be used to achieve procedural equity when addressing climate adaptation solutions. Those chapters are titled Community Engagement, Governance and Budgeting, and Data Metrics and Monitoring. So this was all at one point one big chapter, and it got so long, and there were so many ideas coming out of it that we kind of decided to separate it out and go into more detail on each of these subjects. So just to, I guess, for an example of a deeper dive, the community engagement chapter, which is located in the procedural equity section of the toolkit, highlights all the procedural equity principles and action items on how to effectively engage the community in adaptation processes. So we took learning lessons from the case studies that we featured to kind of synthesize it into these principles. And each principle also has listed several action items that you can take to be sure that you reach the principle. But outside of our overview in these principles, the chapter explores a number of case studies and examples of these actions in action. So one of those examples is the Guide to Community-Centered Engagement in the District of Columbia, which GCC worked on with the District Department of Energy and Environment. So we actually did an on-the-ground project in Ward 7, and we were addressing stormwater flooding in that community, which is a majority community of color. So there we synthesized all the lessons from a year-long community engagement process to address flooding in far northeast Ward 7. So we actually got on the ground and literally wrote down all of our learning opportunities for all to see and to share. But just to go back to this chapter, if you go into it, it also has examples of different procedural equity case studies moved into action based on like what the outcome was. So if you want, you know, a large environmental outcome, you know, here's what Philadelphia did to beat the heat and things like that. So I think this chapter has probably the most examples, and I think a wide variety of, you know, how you can actually move these things into process. So it's really important to check out the community engagement process, in my humble opinion. So the Equitable Adaptation Solutions section of the toolkit has 7 chapters that explores equitable outcomes under certain climate adaptation subject areas. So outside of procedural equity, these chapters explore procedural equity that came out with an actual equitable outcome. So the case studies featured in these chapters also have a strong procedural equity element and will be highlighted in the summaries of the case studies that we include. So each chapter also has 4 to 5 legal and policy tools. And for each of those tools, the economic, the equity, environmental, legal, and administrative considerations are explored. And there's also a lessons learned section for each tool, followed by 2 to 4 case studies that represent the best and emerging practices, displaying implementation of each of these legal and policy tools. So, you know, whatever section of adaptation you're interested in working in, there's probably an example there for you that incorporates both procedural equity and an equitable outcome in one of these sections. For example, this is the natural resilience and green space section of the toolkit. And in each section, like I said, here are the 4 to 5 legal and policy tools that we elevated, but there's also a funding tool section that sometimes has some cross-play into the finance piece of the toolkit as well. One example that was featured in actually several chapters of the toolkit, it's featured in the natural resilience chapter, it's featured in the economic development chapter, as well as the finance chapter, is the Prince George's County Clean Water Partnership. Basically, they were faced, in 2014, PG County was faced with an enormous regulatory challenge in affording the federal permit that needed, you know, to address stormwater systems. So basically, they came up with a community-based public-private partnership. And as a result of the leadership of the county and elected officials, they became the first municipality to utilize a CBP3 model as a solution to address challenges that are facing many jurisdictions across the country. They did an RFP program to get the partnership of Corvius, and under the partnership approach, Corvius and Prince George's County entered into a 30-year partnership to improve the stormwater infrastructure and make commitments to impact the local economy through local targeted disadvantaged subcontractor development and utilization. So these are like the main values of the program. What's great about it is it's been in use in PG County for the past few years, and it's 90% local and minority owned businesses who have been hired to do this green infrastructure work. So that's why it was featured in the economic development chapter as well. So using programs like this can be really innovative and, you know, help you be able to pay for these programs, as well as, you know, make it community based and still, you know, keep that finance piece intact. So to go further into the finance piece of the section, Anne's just going to take it over and talk you through these.
All right, thank you, Tiffany. And Galen, are you ready for me? Go.
Yeah, I'm ready. Let's go.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Anne Perrault. I'm a senior fellow at the Climate Center. And so just by way of the background, the toolkit describes funding and financing options. And by funding, we mean, you know, funds that don't need to be paid back, they're grants. This toolkit, this chapter of the toolkit is focused on financing options, so private sector involvement and finding funds for community adaptation projects. So the chapter describes why communities might choose financing over funding. You know, you need more capital than is readily available, if there are assets that can generate revenues, and you'll understand, I think, a little more what I mean by that as I go through some of the examples. But the chapter describes those things, why you would choose financing over funding. Equity in this context, of course, requires attention to several factors. One, who benefits, who pays, and who's making the decisions. And we've identified these categories of financing. Let's see. Here you can see 4, but I'm going to break them down into 5. But the point is, each of these provides some potential to finance community adaptation. To be very clear, though, not all of these have an inherent focus on equity. And so you need to apply this lens of who benefits, who pays, and who decides when you're using each of these. And so I'll go through each of them. Bonds and bank loans, insurance-related finance, tax credits, which I'm separating from tax increment financing and land value capture, and other public-private partnerships. Today, I'm going to focus on the bonds part and the insurance-related finance part, because really most of the innovations are in these areas. And the tax credits, tax increment financing, those raise real equity concerns, although there are also real opportunities to use them for equitable adaptation. It's a proceed with caution scenario there. So I'll go through bonds. You know, of course, you have your traditional social bonds, environmental bonds, and municipality issues. The bond, the investors pay back a set amount at a set time. You know, it receives benefits in terms of, you know, guarantees from the municipality in exchange for, you know, lower returns, but it's useful for both parties. But the bonds I really want to focus on right now are the environmental and social impact bonds. I'm sure most of you are familiar with these, but I do think they are providing opportunities for innovation, and they're distinguished from regular bonds in a few ways. First, you know, because they're pay for success bonds, the outcomes, the investor benefits are tied to the outcomes. So if there's a better than expected outcome, the investor benefits. If there's a lower than expected outcome, the investor loses. You know, it needs to pay for that. And so in this sense, the investor assumes some of the risks, which is helpful. Secondly, there's a focus on finding an outcome that provides financial benefits that exceed the cost of inaction. And let me go through a few examples so you understand what I'm talking about. I want to go to the next slide. Yeah. So you have the traditional bonds, the sustainability bonds I already dealt with, but I'm looking at the environmental impact bonds, EIBs, as you might know them. And so in this context, I'll give you the example of Louisiana. You know, you have this massive coastal erosion. There was an environmental impact bond issued, Environmental Defense Fund worked on this, and they secured philanthropic help to structure this bond so that they could create natural infrastructure. They could restore wetlands to protect this one road down to the end of the coast that a lot of businesses relied on. These businesses, because they're benefiting from this road, are paying part of the cost of this road. In Iowa, a different environmental impact bond, farmers, you know, secured a bond. They planted cover crops to reduce non-point source pollution. Because they reduced the non-point source pollution, they were giving tradable credits under the Clean Water Act that were monetized and used to pay for the cover crop. And the Atlanta Environmental Impact Bond was a different situation where there were 6 green infrastructure projects to manage stormwater in economically distressed areas. And, you know, if they weren't dealing with those stormwater issues, the cost would be 18 million. Because they did, it's 14 million. So they're using that savings to pay for the bonds. So that's That's the big picture examples of the environmental impact bonds and the social impact bonds. And the one reason these are important to think about is because increasingly financial regulators, the financial system is paying attention to climate risks. And you may have seen that the first US financial regulator ever issued a report on climate risks 2 weeks ago, and it said, we need to build these risks into various assets. And when that happens, of course, measures to protect these so-called assets like bridges and roads and the like, you know, if you have flood walls, for example, you can, these assets will be more easily priced on the market, and you can use these environmental impact bonds and social impact bonds to secure investments in ways I think previously were more difficult. So people are moving into this space in big ways. There's a group called Quantified Ventures that's based in DC that's doing a lot of this work. So that's an important one to pay attention to, I think, the environmental impact bonds. Another source of lending, if you could go back to the other previous slide, the first one, yeah, is the bank loans. And of course, you know, you have your traditional bank loans, but increasingly there are more green banks, community development financial institutions. These entities have a mandate to fund socially important, environmentally important projects. Of course, these can be adaptation projects, and they secure capital through things like surcharges on electricity rates. And so I think we'll see an expansion of green banks in the US, community development financial institutions that will provide low interest loans for some of these community adaptation efforts. Now, I said I wanted to focus also on insurance related, let me see my notes here. The insurance related financing, it's really pretty simple. The upshot is that insurance savings are translated into a revenue stream for community adaptation. And let me give you a good example here. There's a group called My Strong Homes, and what they realized is that insurance companies would benefit from reduced risk of climate impacts. And so they might be willing to lower insurance premiums for folks who deal with those risks. So what they did here was approached insurance companies, they do this now throughout the South, and say, will you reduce insurance premiums for these folks in Louisiana, Georgia, and you know, Alabama? They retrofit their homes with new roofs that meet these fortified standards. The insurance company said, sure, because 75% of the premiums are, you know, about wind risks, and these roofs minimize that risk. So in exchange for this reduced risk and the reduced cost that the insurance companies face, they reduce the premiums. These homeowners are using the savings in their premiums to pay for their new roofs. There's a new paper out, new 2019, by folks Vojala and Rhodes that describes a whole range of ways you can use insurance savings to fund climate adaptation efforts, including, for example, through large-scale protection efforts. Again, I go back to the flood wall. If you have several, you know, families that are relying on this wall or community members and they share an insurer, you can work with this insurer to do the same things they're doing with My Strong Home. Let's see. So that's for the insurance related savings, which, like bonds, provides good opportunities moving forward. So you can go back up to the top, to the first slide, please. Thanks. Now we move into the areas that get a little dicier when it comes to equity. It just requires real attention to the three, you know, criteria I mentioned earlier, because tax credit programs, for example, is when credits are given to investors toward their, say, federal income tax if they invest in a given area. So they make investments under the new market tax program. They make investments under that program in these community development entities. They give a chunk of money to these community development entities. The community development entities decide how this money is spent, and they have a mandate to spend it on, socially helpful, environmentally helpful projects, which can be adaptation projects. Of course, there are concerns that investors could benefit more than folks living in these areas. That's a huge concern. They have the national level new market tax program, but then they have some state level tax credit programs in Massachusetts and Maryland, and I'm imagining other states will follow suit, but do the same thing. I think the parameters around the investments there are more robust, so you need worry less about who's benefiting in this context. The other program is called, I'm sure familiar with it, Opportunity Zones, because that's received a lot of press, where areas are designated, and if you invest in these areas, if you're an investor, you get different tax benefits. So there are huge concerns here about who benefits and about gentrification. And groups like Kresge and other organizations developed a set of criteria that can be used to provide guardrails for these investments that are very important, but that's another option for financing. Then I'll move to tax increment financing and land value capture. This is not too dissimilar in that if you have an increase in property values because of usually it's some publicly supported development, then you can either use increased property taxes to pay for the development, or you can impose some other fee. And needless to say, you need to be very, very careful about who's paying these property taxes. And I've seen arguments that are not arguments, but a scenario where a metro rail expansion that benefits businesses, you could have these businesses pay a fee for the benefits they secure from the metro rail expansion close to their businesses, and that fee pays for these community adaptation projects in this area. But again, lots of potential and lots of potential for harm if you're not paying attention to those efforts. Then finally, we have the final catch-all, public-private partnerships. Tiffany mentioned one, of course, in Corvius in Prince George's County. But essentially what this is private entities that are using their specialized expertise. So just wrapping this up, whole public-private partnerships. It's about private sector entities using their specialized expertise to streamline procurement, streamline implementation, to save funding for public entities, make public dollars stretch. Tiffany described in the Corvius example that it's also about using, you could use minority labor to do these projects. There are many, many examples, of course, of public-private partnerships for equitable adaptation, and those are described more in the chapter. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm glad to answer any questions, and thanks so much for this opportunity to describe the work.
Thank you so much. Anna and Tiffany, this is great. And I think I'm just going to invite everybody. I'm feeling this in myself right now for some reason, but just to move around a little bit and think about what we just heard. It's as simple as just moving your head and turning your eyes and looking up and looking down and maybe stretch your hands out. I'm just doing this because I feel like it's 12:30. I've been sitting at my desk for roughly 3.5 hours right now. I think this is really helpful, and I wanted to share something that Shalini Bahala was saying. She said that finance is set up for private equity, not social equity, and so we have to work backward from implementation to make equity to make the project equitable, not forward from the finance point. And I would just love to hear what you guys have to say about that. And also, as they're responding, I just want to, we have some questions that are in, I'm looking for something and I lost this. Okay, so we just have some questions, but I think they're generally like, for the members of the committee, how do you assess equity in funding and financing your projects right now? Is there a project that you're excited about that has a lack of money you'd like to talk about or bring up? If you could imagine ways you could use the GCC toolkit, maybe you could share those with us or commit to doing one of those. And how can interested parties find financial resources early in the process that align with the vision and the cost? It's another question to think about. And are there any projects that Tiffany and Ann can talk about that give examples of innovative finance mechanisms that were used to really help move a project to completion? I think those are some of the questions that we had just to get things started, but feel free to bring up any. Yeah. And yeah, Tiffany and Ann, I'll let you just respond to what I said, and then we're going to start. I will read questions from the chat.
Well, I just say that the questions you outlined, I'd love to hear the answers from members of this group. I see Joyce and others have done a lot of work in this area. So, you know, how do you assess equity in your projects? What are the, you know, is the toolkit missing any key areas for equitable adaptation? We'd love to know that. It's an iterative process. So that's the sort of thing I'd be interested in knowing.
I will say, just to piggyback off of what Ann just said, if you look into that community engagement process chapter, there's a section basically titled Utilizing General Frameworks and Guidance that just lists a bunch of resources that can guide you on making sure that you are, I guess, implementing equity and kind of scales to see where your project stands. And there's several resources that already exist and are included in that chapter that could be helpful in engaging your project if you are already started or are planning to start something, just to see, you know, where you stand on the scale of actually, you know, properly engaging a community or properly being equitable in your procedure, at the least in the procedure process. You can't always guarantee the outcome, but if you start with the procedure, more likely you're going to have an equitable outcome. I saw a question in the box about eco districts. And that's a really interesting subject because I'm also on a Prince George's County Environmental Justice Commission, and we're establishing eco districts in some of the environmental justice communities. And, you know, it's statutorily created by tax credits, new job tax credits, and federal tax credits. But if anyone else has a better understanding of incorporating eco districts, I'd like to hear, I don't know who asked the question, but I'd like to hear what your thoughts on that is.
Yeah, I'm not sure, the VGA, whoever asked that question, do you have any thoughts? What are you thinking about with the eco district?
That was me, Valerie. I had asked the question. I'm still trying to understand the toolkit, so I don't know how in-depth a question I can ask, but I just saw a lot of the same principles were overlapping. And since they're really working already with a lot of projects, or they're trying to work with a lot of projects in cities, how this toolkit kind of saw as an interface, or if they had reached out to them, or if there's any communication. The one thing that I always don't want to see is that we do these things in silo. and that one group is off doing something and another one is doing something, and we don't actually reach out and talk to each other. So I think that was more of my question at this point. Were you aware of them? And then is there any understanding to like maybe try to reach across the corner and talk to each other?
Yeah, definitely aware of them, and specifically the one in Maryland. Haven't really seen it go into implementation, which is why it wasn't featured in the toolkit. But like Ann said, this is a growing process. So as projects get completed and we have an understanding of them, we've been adding case studies regularly. So I'm definitely interested in following that one in particular because of my commission work and because I live here. Definitely, it's on our radar. We just want to see it actually get put into implementation.
Yeah, that part is a little, they've been around for a while, but where they're at right now is rather a newer process step for them. So I understand. Anyways, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Joyce, why don't you go?
Well, first, I just want to give a big mea culpa because I have not delved into the toolkit, which is one of the reasons why I joined today, because I needed the human contact to tell me, hey, this is the thing. It's finally answering so many questions. So I just want to say congratulations, and also that I'm still very ignorant of what you've created. So I will be getting more in detail. But could I just ask another question related to sort of challenges that I have heard about just the question of putting the question of social equity with financial equity in the same sentence. So frequently, what we know is that money follows money. And the people who work in money have only given lip service to social equity, right? I mean, these are financial investors, whatever. But I'm even speaking of, let's just say, the chief financial officer in a city, if such a thing even exists, right? For a smaller city, it might be the budget director. Social equity issues are not front of mind, except for when there's a conflagration, right? And they have to be faced with reality. And so I'm wondering, how can we use the toolkit to invite more finance leaders into the solutions that you have created? These are finance leaders that might not put social equity first, but they need to understand that there are, in fact, mechanisms and means to move money into lower resource communities. So are there any hooks you've used? Do you expect that the toolkit would be used by such a person? And what can we do to help?
I definitely think it would be used by such a person. And my favorite hook is shame. If they know someone next door is doing it, it always works. Like they're gonna, they're doing this amazing thing in Miami. It's Miami, it's a Republican state, and they're doing Miami Forever bonds, and the banks are giving money to Catalyst Miami to do these amazing disaster preparedness program, and we're here in Maryland not doing anything. Like, shame is the best tool, and I think case studies are the best way to start with that, is to show what other people and what other cities are doing. Mm-hmm. So if there's something that relates to what you're trying to do, putting that example out there always helps.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Joyce, I'd like to turn this back to you because you have given this a lot of thought, I know. And, I think about the recent, in addition to the CFTC report that Beth posted, the U.S. Commodities Future Trading Commission report looking at climate risk series, as you know, issued a recent report on climate risks. And, it's clear that assets that are important to, resilience and adaptation, assets like roads and bridges and, everything, will begin to reflect climate risks. And that gives us an opportunity to say, you better get going here, finance folks, because there are opportunities. The space is increasing, but it will be filled, and you need to get on board and not only do it for financial reasons, but do it for these, long list of mm-hmm. equity reasons. And so, that occurs to me, but I'd love to know what you're thinking about what's going on and climate risk and how that might be helpful for thinking about equity.
Yeah. Well, Galen, you're going to cut us off if you don't want us to keep down this path, but I just have maybe 2-minute response It's okay?
Yeah, go quickly. We have some time to chat.
All right, great. Well, so I think two things. One is that in infrastructure modernization, lower income communities and BIPOC communities are left behind. So simply because there is a demand for more resilient infrastructure in a city does not mean that the money will flow to the part of the city that needs it most. So we know this to be true. But I do think that we have one potential solution, and both of you actually, I think, touched on this, and that is that right now it's a teachable moment. Cities have to show their constituents that they have done something around systemic racism. And if they can show that they have done something by allocating funds that already were set aside for like their stormwater management or their lead pipelines for water or whatever it may be, that they are allocating those funds to a community that has other marginalizations that they face, and therefore they're solving for so many different problems. I think this is a really good time for that. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to help them with the measures. Here you are, Chief Financial Officer, and your mayor is saying to you, we need less violence, we need more kids going to school every day, we need less asthma. Okay, we're going to show you how this resilience project does those three things, or whatever it is that is on the top of the list for the mayor trying to get reelected. So I guess, it's a little namby-pamby, but I'm struggling with the fact that many of us do not have new money. We need to use existing money in new ways. And in order to do that, we have to figure out, why would they do that? Why would they use money in a new way? They've got their groove. It's easy. And so solving for these other things during this teachable moment, I think, seems very, very profoundly important. I think you all are doing that already. I'm not saying this is a new idea. It's your idea. I'm just echoing it.
Co-benefits are definitely key in convincing, your leaders to do something. Like working with the Department of Health and you're trying to, work on some environmental issues makes sense. And, if you both put your money together to do something like that, then it will definitely get done if you have that cross collaboration. So co-benefits are super important.
Trevor had a question about funding for tribes, and do you want to ask that, Trevor?
Yep. Hi. Yeah, so I do a lot of work with Native American tribes out west, and I was just curious if there are any examples of social or environmental impact bonds being used with tribal communities.
I have not run into any specific examples of that, Trevor. I suggest that you reach out to Quantified Ventures to ask them if they might know, or Trevor, Joyce, you might know. You don't. Okay. So there's a group in the University of Maryland that looks at these bonds too. You could reach out to them, the finance, I forget the name of it, but group there, but I'm sorry, Trevor, I don't.
Yeah, I'd have to echo that. We have a few case studies that focus on Native American tribes. Like there's some retreat stuff, but because we're a law and policy institution and we'd have to be experts in tribal law to actually analyze that, it's a little harder for our 10-person team to figure out. But I would say, I know like UNC Pembroke, they have a strong Native legal background that are probably, and they're definitely looking into some retreat work there. So I'm not sure exactly how they're paying for it, but it's called Lumberton and they're doing some relocation work down there. So that would be an interesting place to look into. Also, we have a little more controversial on the equity side, but there's the Managed Retreat Toolkit that Georgetown Climate Center put out. And there are some case studies in there, including that Lumberton case study that you could probably check out and see what the finance mechanisms behind those are.
And I know in the chat, Sharon had responded to this. I don't know if Sharon, if you have any other references that you would share with the group. I think this is a really important topic of where these legal resources and these kind of emerging financial or emerging finance tools reach and where they don't reach. So any other thoughts you'd share out loud would be wonderful.
Thanks, Beth, and thank you, Tiffany, for mentioning the importance of tribal law in this situation, because the situation with financing and particularly with taxation on tribal lands is very different. Since tribes generally don't have a tax base, and that is how a lot of the financing gets paid off, a lot of this isn't as applicable on tribal lands. I know in some cases with relocation, particularly Ile de Jean Charles is the poster child for relocation. That's all federal money, and that's where a lot of the funding comes from with the federal government's trust responsibility. So it is good to look at this and be thinking about it, and yet also to acknowledge that this isn't always applicable for every government organization. Thanks, Beth, for bringing that up too.
I have something to add, especially around the tribal conversation. And so a lot of the dollars we mentioned are from federal pools of money. And so thinking about organizations or entities that are private or run in other ways, that can be almost an in-between in terms of like helping to accept monies, or if they have the opportunity to take up the time where they have the money up front for certain communities and then can actually wait some of that time for the federal government to give that back. Different organizations and folks that I've heard talk about it have called it different things, but it's essentially having a basically financial partner for these communities. Finance can't be what stops us all the time. And we know the federal government has a bunch of hoops, hurdles, and barriers for communities and people in general to jump through for all their programs. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to take the monies that we do have, and as we said before, think about how we can be more thoughtful and innovative in the ways that we're using it. And again, being more innovative with the partners that we bring together to do this work. Justice and equity work is going to be undoing hundreds of years worth of crap. And so it's not going to be easy. And we have to be very, 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 very innovative. We have to be very persistent, and we have to really pull out the things that don't seem to stick together. You just kind of throw it at the wall and hope that it's going to stick. But at this point, it's really taking as many of the different tools that we do have and just figuring out how we can make them work together, even if we've never thought to use them together before.
Thanks, Shamika. I want to kick this back to everybody else, but a lot of people who haven't spoken yet. And I'm just wondering what you're thinking and if how what you're hearing today relates to your work, or if it doesn't, and if it doesn't, why not? Because maybe it does. And then we give Tiffany and Anne a chance to make that link. So if anybody wants to share their thoughts right now, please jump in.
Hey,
if you're on the phone, you can talk.
This is Sarah. I'll just, I guess, share a little bit about what I'm thinking about. Thanks for that invitation, Galen. So I'm a board member of a Sustainable Business Roundtable. So, we're trying to think about how we can help our for-profit businesses with their strategies for climate change adaptation that takes, equity and justice into account. And so I guess part of my reasoning behind attending this particular webinar is I'm trying to sort of shape out what we think we can do internally and accomplish on behalf of our members to support them in this. And so I know it seems like a lot of the toolkit is really focused on municipal solutions, although granted, I haven't looked too in depth at it yet. But so I guess I'm just thinking about how to, push businesses into engaging in this work.
I would definitely point you to the economic resilience chapter. Pretty much everything that you're looking for will be found there. It goes into a comprehensive economic development strategies and business continuity plans for local businesses and local hiring and requirements and incentives. So there are some good examples there. It also has some statewide plans and programs, as well as municipal and local. So I would definitely check out that chapter.
Thanks, Tiffany.
No problem.
Sarah, unrelated to the toolkit, and this is not something I'm telling your business to go and apply for or do or become, but I think that they offer a great framework that you can look at, particularly for for-profits, and it's the B Corp handbook or the B Corp model or framework. You don't need to take everything, you don't need to take anything at all, but particularly for for-profit businesses, looking at things internally. Joyce is making a face. I'm not sure if that's at me, so you may want to comment, but I have seen folks take some of the work that was in B Corp as a way to infuse it into their internal practices, but I would love for Joyce to make her comments.
Okay, I'll be really swift here, but I was a B Corp. I paid the $1,000. I did it for 2 years. It was phenomenal. It really improved my business process, but really major but. They're all about poverty alleviation. They're all about social equity. And when they went to COP, the Conference of the Parties, they released a climate platform that said nothing about resilience. It was all about a 2030 net zero goal. And in fact, lots of other firms have had that net zero goal. So where B Corp is supposed to be somewhat new and unique, they came 2 years late to the party on that, or maybe let's say 20 years. And in addition, every one of the corporations they brought, all they said was net zero by 2020, net zero by 20, like throughout the whole thing. It was extremely frustrating. I had been working with them for over 2 months because I realized this was a problem, and they were extremely resistant to adaptation resilience. To them, it's like, oh, we're giving in because that means we shouldn't do, mitigation. What they said to me, like they're on record saying is, isn't adaptation where everyone has to eat algae? So I just want to say, I don't know if you guys know, there's this hyper adaptation group that I think they're amazing. I think they have a lot of learning to do around climate adaptation resilience and how it relates to their mission. It seems so obvious to us because their mission is about corporations working to decrease social inequities and poverty. But on the other hand, when they actually launch something, it doesn't relate to those elements. So a bit of a word for wise.
Just for clarity, to get back to Sarah's actual question though, would you still not then recommend that to someone who is looking for guidance? I wouldn't say, again, I don't think she should join it. I particularly think their fees are ridiculous. I don't know how some folks can afford it when it's an equity thing. That's a whole nother conversation to have. But I mean, not for the resilience and adaptation piece, for the specifically looking at like metrics and goals and ways to internally do some improving, especially for a for-profit business. Would you still not suggest even the framework? I'm not saying.
No, I think as I said, I got a lot out of it, but I do think buyer beware, because here we are on the adaptation, American Society of Adaptation Professionals. And so you have to do the work of bridging between what you know is really right around climate adaptation, reducing systemic and eviscerating systemic racism. You have to do that work because they will not have done any of it for you. So just beware.
So, hi, this is Ann Doherty. Hi. So the one thing I keep thinking, working for a family-owned, smallish, medium-sized business, is that we are going to get strongly behind resilient thinking. I have 5 people there who are in this now with me, right? As sustainability manager, being resilient. The other 695 employees and the management are going to get behind this when they see, I know I'm saying this out loud, the tax advantages, when they see how this makes our family-owned company help our small community better. We love our communities that we're in, right? So the 3, we don't care about the big cities. We care about 3 rural cities or 3 rural areas. Actually, one is a small neighborhood in Miami. So 2 rural, 1 city. But we will absolutely do what we can for our people in our areas when we can understand how it's helping them and it's helping us. So and that's why I love this group, because we are going to think of common sense solutions to this. And we're just going to, my guys who right now are resisting, they just wonder what I'm talking about, right? But 2 years from now, as soon as they hear of a good tax break, or something, they're just going to tip right over, because this makes total sense. What ASAP is doing makes total sense. Thanks. And I love B Corp for me to get my sort of mojo going again, getting excited about everything. But again, they're not going to follow that, because they are, you know, Joyce, if you're saying that B Corp is a couple years behind this group, my company is about 10 years behind both of them. So thanks.
And can you describe your company a little bit more? I mean, you can either say what it is or just like what
yeah.
type of industry it's in.
Sure, we're in flooring. We make rubber and vinyl floors and wall base. 700 employees, 5 plants, family owned. You know, that's literally Mr., Mrs., and then daughter, who is my generation. And the average manager age is 70 plus, average. I have many colleagues who have been working there for 50 years. So that's a board, and that's a way of thinking that, you know, they're very, very value oriented, as in Warren Buffett kind of value, and kind of depression era thinking, right? Can I pay the least possible for this? But boy, do they treat their people right. That's also part of that value orientation, is people matter, really matter. So yeah, I know that they're going to tip into this, what this group is doing, as soon as they can see it.
Yeah, in thinking about co-benefits, it's not just like a public health plus environment. It's also kind of reaching your audience. If they worry about money and you can get them money in a way and also create a more resilient something, then go for that. Even changing the word from adaptation to resilience is a thing that helps get things done. And sometimes you just hide resilience and mitigation and it still helps get things done. You just got to do what you got to do to get these ideas out there.
Anyone else? Thoughts in your head just kind of coming out? Things you'd like to talk about? So opening up space, feel free to just like interject, otherwise I will keep us going. In terms of using the website, right, and putting this into our work, have you, I know it's only been like up for a month and a half now, about, right, maybe 2 months. Have you heard any like success stories, or do you have any suggestions for how I kind of go through, navigate, and use it? And Tiffany, you could even maybe pull up the screen and show us, or just, you know, to put you on the spot, how do I make this useful? Because like I've definitely forwarded it to my office, and my office has forwarded it around, because I'm in the Office of Resilience. We're all like, we want this, you know? And like, for example, we're talking about how do you use, you know, community-based assets, like, you know, what assets are there, and assess those and use those in our work, rather than just real estate-based assets, which in Miami is a big thing. Yeah, like there was a section that you said we could, unless other people have questions, you know, jump in. But there was a section that in the procedural chapter, I think, about how we could kind of formally assess our work. Do you want to just show it to us so that we know how to do that?
Sure. So the toolkit is a lot, and I don't expect everyone, can everyone see it? Yeah, I don't expect everyone to read through the whole thing. I think you have to think about what you're interested in, and start from there. But I would definitely always start with, you know, the purpose and methodology, because it'll help you guide yourself through, you know, where you need to go. Outside of that, you know, first things first is procedural equity, because like I said, I think if you ground your work in procedural equity, the outcomes will likely, you know, be more equitable in that sense. So if you go into the next chapter, I mean, it's, you know, clickable online, pretty easy. There are pictures. You know, take your time running through. But if you go in through the community engagement chapter, so kind of introduces you to the problem. There's a background of, you know, what's been done as far as not enough community engagement and how we got to this problem, and you know, how we're making it work, how we're changing it. There's also a section on key players, which explores who is necessary to have an effective community engagement process for this particular chapter. So of course, you know, the members, community-based organizations, businesses, like we mentioned, city agencies, facilitators, research partners, all necessary players. Like, you don't think, you know, I just, you know, host a community meeting and that's it. It's, you know, a bigger deal, definitely, to have effective community engagement. So this background material just kind of sets you up for what you might not expect is needed to have a successful process. Outside of that, like I said, these are the principles, like overarching principles that we kind of pulled from case studies that we feel like are most important. And then for each principle, there are action items for things that you can do. And of course, you know, footnotes, so you can go exactly to the resource, you know, where we're getting this from. Those are super important, not just in the legal and policy world, but if you really want more information on how to co-define a vision, go directly to the source. You know, we're really here to compile the resources for you and have it all in one place so that you don't have to, you know, go searching and not find what you need. So again, for each principle, all the several action items, and then there's kind of like a overview of the chapter. So basically, how we divided the case studies is utilizing general frameworks and guidance, making community engagement law, and accounting for the cost, and creating environmental benefits. So and looking for how to gauge your process. If you have an existing process, you probably go into like utilizing general frameworks and guidance. So these case studies, so when I say case studies, I also include case studies and resources. So some of the case studies are just resources that you could use to get something done. And then some of the case studies are literally case studies. This is an on the ground project for how, you know, we did that work. So like I mentioned in the earlier presentation, this is GCC's guide. So as we list the resources or the case studies, you give like a quick summary of that thing. So, you know, you can just read it really quick if it's something that might be helpful for you or not, which is why we, you know, take the time to summarize every resource. So outside of that, if you actually, you know, go to the resource, you get that short explanation of it, but then you get a little bit of a longer summary of it. Good ASAP is on the, you know, featured here. So you can actually go here and see more about what's going on. But then if you look at this, like actually going into the resource, it'll show you like the, you know, the actual resource, and it'll also show you that scale where you can gauge how your planning process is going within this resource. So, and there are actually a few resources that have a different scale. So you choose what works for you, but it's in this resource, particularly the scale for, you know, if you're effectively engaging or not. Can't remember exactly which page it's on, but it's in here somewhere. But that's how it works as far as, you know, the individual chapter. So it takes you from the actual toolkit to our adaptation clearinghouse for a summary, and then you go to resource and you'll get the full resource, you know, whatever that may be. And a lot of these resources look 64 pages, which is why we do summaries, because who has time for that in the work that we do? Apparently we do. So that's what we do, is summarize, you know, make it easier for you guys to be able to go through quickly and kind of get what you need done. When you're thinking about substantive outcomes and you have a particular purpose, you know, like, you know, economic resilience, like the businesses and things like that, it might be easier and faster for you to just go directly there and go, you know, you're looking for workforce development, and go exactly where you're looking for and get the information that you need. But if you're really just starting from nowhere, you know, I would say start with introduction, procedural equity pieces, and just kind of dive into the areas that, you know, you're working in or that interest you most. Ironically, like I came from an energy background, so that was the first chapter that I wrote because that's what I knew most about. And it all flowed from this chapter. So like the framework for how, you know, our goals are listed, how the key players, the background, how it's organized. Each chapter is organized the same way. So I started with this chapter for exactly what does like an elementary school implementer need to understand how to create more equitable, resilient energy systems, and just kind of use the same framework, gave it to every author so that they can, you know, do it for their particular subject area. So that's how it works. Does anyone have any specific questions on how it works?
It's beautiful work.
I'm just going to say thank you. Oh yeah, go Ann.
It's just gorgeous work. It's really good work.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really great.
I've just going through it a bit more. I've found it that the language is quite clear, actually. So it might be a little intimidating to look at it because it's so big, but I just want to encourage people to dig into a section that might be helpful, because I've already found ways of framing arguments that they're just clear, and equity is in the center of making things more functional or, you know, working. So I'm excited by it, and it's nice to hear more about the process of how it was created.
Yeah, our audience. So this is a CRESD funded project, and you know their work is focused on urban cities. So that's why our audience is local governments, but particularly also community-based organizations, which is why the language is so clear and not legalese and policy language, is because the audience is so, you know, wide. So not only is this for policymakers, this is also for a community-based organization that wants to work with a policymaker to get something done. So there's a lot of language here that you're going to be able to use and take to your government or take to your community and literally read from and have it be relatable. And as far as like putting it together, like I said, we have a pretty decent group of authors within the GCC team and Georgetown team as well. And we also had an advisory group. So our advisory group was full of community-based organization representatives, city government representatives, federal government representatives, state government representatives. Literally, they're, as you can see here, from all over. And they guided us through the development of the toolkit. So as I was thinking about the outline, you know, I presented it to them, what's missing, does this work? We presented to them several times on like, this is what each chapter looks like. These are case studies we're featuring. They gave us recommendations for case studies to feature. So they were very essential in putting this together. So we wanted it to be useful. And these are people who would use it. So we worked directly with practitioners to get it done. So it will be useful to you in some way. And we're hoping that it is, because we worked with people who would use it to get it done.
Thanks, Tiffany. I think I'm seeing that it's already 1:15, so I think we're gonna need to wrap this up and finish up the meeting. That's great. Anne, is there anything you wanted to add at the end here?
No, I just want to say thanks again for letting us, for sharing your time with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I think just to get us going and keep going, we really appreciate all of this work, and I can see how I'm going to use it already.